So we've talked about reaction. We've talked about the fight-flight reaction. And in a minute, I'm going to be talking about another reaction, the freeze reaction. And in this section, I'll also be talking about depression because depression can be part of a freeze reaction or connected to a freeze reaction. But I want to review just for a moment about fight and flight. And you remember that the fight and flight is when your body is preparing to deal with something really big. And even if it's a thought and you're not actually needing to get away or to fight, you've got all of those chemicals running through your body and your whole system preparing for it, and that can cause quite a bit of discomfort. And just a little story to help you remember this. I'm thinking about my dog, and if you have a dog or you know a dog, you probably are very familiar with this. And what happens when the male person comes? Ours happens to be a male man. And even though this is a daily occurrence, my particular dog feels like she really needs to bark, 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 bark. And that's the fight, the fight instinct. And I, in my attempts and my training, try to calm her and I'll say shush, and she at some point will be able to settle. And as she's gotten older, she can settle more quickly, but she still has to go into that fight and she just can't help it. So that gives you an idea of what fight looks like, that fight response. And we can feel that in us when something comes along that is as maybe inane as, a person delivering the mail. And we just get charged up. And then we realize, oh, maybe it's not that bad, or whatever it is passes and it's not as bad as we thought it was going to be. Or maybe it is pretty bad, but we didn't need to get that charge going. So that's the fight response. As we talked about, kind of the flight response is to avoid, not be present, you know, just not deal with. And that feeling comes up also. The last one of these is the freeze reaction. Now, there is one more, and that is kind of navigating or negotiating. That's a higher level reaction. It's actually more of a response, and it's only available to humans, not to animals. But this freeze reaction is something that I really want to talk about because that can be quite difficult. So, there's a time where you realize that you can't fight and you can't get away from it. MS is something like that. Physical discomfort can be something like that, and you begin to shut down or collapse. It happens, this reaction, when the brain determines that fight or flight will not work. And this is called the freeze reaction. This is the kind of the deer in the headlight reaction. And sometimes people freeze in thinking about MS. And I will talk more about what that looks like. So some of the symptoms of a freeze reaction are this just overwhelming fatigue and great need for sleep. Now, yes, this is also a symptom of MS, but we need to know for ourselves, is this an MS symptom or am I reacting? Am I getting overwhelmed? Blues, sadness, depression can be a freeze reaction. There's an emptiness, a spaciness. You're not really daydreaming, you're just blank. Have difficulty with memory. And during this time, there can be either a hypersensitivity to pain or almost a not being present in the body at all. Just a complete shutdown and a decreased interest in food. So think about times where you get overwhelmed and all of a sudden you just feel that shutdown. Someone has turned off the switch. There's a spaciness, there's a disorientation, there's a I don't care anymore. That is the freeze response. But you can get some help with the freeze reaction. So, as I said before, all of these symptoms can also be present in MS, and there is not a relationship between the freeze reaction and MS. Some of the symptoms are similar. But if you are experiencing these reactions on a regular basis, it would be important to talk with someone about this because there is a way out. So you can ask for a referral to a mental health professional for an evaluation, but it's also helpful to know, is this happening as a reaction to something or is this MS? And there's many other ways to deal with the fight, the flight, and the freeze. And as you learn more coping skills, you'll be better able to deal with freeze. And you may have experienced some of the freeze reaction when you're getting information in this particular week or in other weeks, or all of a sudden your eyes just glaze over. It's possibly because something felt overwhelming. I don't want to hear about this. I'm never going to understand this. It's too difficult, going into the freeze reaction. So there is a higher incidence of depression in people living with MS, and this is well documented. There's a higher incidence of depression for people, of course, that are living with any physical challenge or chronic illness. But within the population of people living with physical challenges or chronic illness, depression and MS is even higher. There's a couple of reasons for this. One of the reasons could be because of the way MS affects the brain. And there are also some medications, treatments for MS that also have the side effect of depression. So there's quite a high incidence. But depression is very stressful on you and your body, and if you struggled with it, you know about this. And not only is it hard to be living with depression, but there's also a link between depression and the inflammation present with pain. So it's depressing to have pain, but also depression can increase inflammation and increase pain. So it's not unusual for people when they're depressed to have more pain. But again, as with the freeze reaction and with everything else, you don't need to struggle. There is help. So some signs for depression are sadness or irritability, loss of interest or pleasure in everyday activities, loss of appetite or an increase in appetite, sleep disturbance, either insomnia or excessive sleeping. There's an agitation or the opposite, a slowing of behavior. Fatigue. Again, this is different than MS fatigue. MS fatigue is an exhaustion that comes physically over you when you are psychologically maybe in a very good mood and your body's just wiped out. That's MS fatigue. Depression, it just feels like it's like a wet blanket type of fatigue. Everything just slows down in the mud, trudging through. There's feelings of worthlessness or guilt, problems thinking, and there can be, with some people in much more serious situations, persistent thoughts of death or suicide. So if you're experiencing these symptoms, please seek a referral to a mental health professional, and this referral can be available to you through the 800 number at the National MS Society that you already have, or through your physician. For treatment for depression, I'll say one more thing about depression. For treatment of depression, the research has shown that the best treatment for depression is often for people a combination of a medication and psychotherapy. That the combination is better than each on its own for a more severe depression. For a milder depression that may not need a medication, psychotherapy can be quite helpful. Exercise is also helpful with depression, and I've given you resources for depression because there's been a tremendous amount written about depression and MS. So I've talked about reactions, the fight, flight, freeze. And let's talk for just a minute about reaction versus response. A reaction is automatically responding. It's almost out of your control. Your body keys up, your mouth goes, and you're there before you even realize it. And this is what happens when your body is in a fight, flight, or freeze reaction. Response is noting that there is a stressor and being able to choose what to do. And you may say, oh, that sounds nice. There are ways that you can slow down the process between stressor and reaction. And some of these exercises, some of these assignments can help you do that. Because we want to have the choice. Sometimes we react without thinking, but we really want to have the choice. So, one more thought about managing stress. You've been given a number of assignments about stress management. You have lots of ideas about stress management from the last couple of weeks and from this week. And certainly the tools you'll be learning from here on out can be helpful for both stress and pain management. But it's important for you to begin to consider, because you've been using your log to see what works and what doesn't, to begin to consider which techniques you want to continue to use, which you'd like to learn more about, and use some of the references and resources to learn more about it. As this is an overview, and there's much more to each one of the techniques that I'll be presenting in this program. It's just one example. There are so many other examples. You may choose a technique just because you like it. And if you find one you really like, I want to encourage you to broaden your ability to participate in this. So go beyond what you're getting from this program and see what resources may be available in the community.